and I became friends a number of years ago, and when we were together, you could not imagine like a more ridiculous pair of individuals. You may not have noticed, but I like to wear like button-down press shirts and eat like arugula salads. I look like I belong in church. Everything about this face looks clean cut. I like grew up on a farm and like fairy tale beginnings of Christian beginnings. If I cursed, most of you would start laughing because it would sound so ridiculous coming out of my mouth, right? My favorite was just a couple weeks ago. I'm probably going to embarrass someone here, but I was in a very serious pastoral meeting with a young lady at our church. I mean, that's serious when we're talking about theological issues and life change and Jesus Christ. And then after the meeting, she goes off and has some dinner with some friends, and it comes back to me, her report on what she took out of our meeting. She told her friends, Paul has perfect complexion. Like, seriously, like his skin, I'm so jealous. That's what she said. And I'm thinking, after our deep theological conversation, your reflection is, what's Paul's skin regime? If I look like I belong in church, Brett looked like he belonged in prison. No one ever asked him about his skin regime, okay? He's like tattoos and scars everywhere. Like, he's the type of one, the guy, like, he's walking down the street, like, small children and women start fleeing from him. Like, he looked like a monster. And to be honest, part of his past was that he was a monster. He grew up in the ghetto. I grew up on a farm. I looked like I belonged in church. He looked like he belonged in prison. When I was in seminary studying the Bible, he was literally a drug dealer. But here's the thing that drew us together. Brett met Jesus. And it changed him. Like he met Jesus. It turned his life inside out. And all the anger and the hatred and the pain that he had felt poured into all those other things, he now poured this deep, crazy passion into his love for Jesus Christ. And that drew us together. The thing is Brett was still a mess. So, early on, early on, the first month after he became saved, he read the entire Bible. And then he came to me and he said, Paul, I found something out. I found out there are Christians who live their entire lives and have never read the whole Bible. How is that possible? And I'm like, that's a good question. But that type of just like unstoppable passion was burning in him. But like I said, he's still, even though he'd read the whole Bible, he was a mess. Even though he loved Jesus, he was a mess. So like one Sunday after church, he comes up to me. He's like, Paul, there's this awesome UFC fight this week. You want to go to Hooters with me and watch the game or watch the fight? And I'm sitting there at the door, and I'm like, you are at church. You just invited your pastor to go watch men beat each other into submission while large bosom women serve us pitchers of beer. Like, that's awesome. That's awesome. I didn't go. But it's awesome. You know why it's awesome? Because this is a guy who didn't know that was inappropriate to ask your pastor to go watch men beat each other while large bosom women serve you beer. It didn't compute. Like, he didn't know how to act. All he knew was Jesus. All he knew was Jesus. All he knew was Jesus. And that was beautiful. He was a mess, but he was a beautiful mess. And so when we come to Corinth, I want you to think of Brett. It is full of people who are a beautiful mess. People who don't know how to act as Christians. They don't know how you're supposed to behave. They don't know how to do church. They don't know how to fit into that mold, but all they know is Jesus. That's all they know. You know, for the next 9 months, we are going to be diving in headlong into this text, this rich, rich text called 1 Corinthians, this letter. And let me just say, the launch is the Corinthian church. These Corinthians, they get a bad rap, and there's a good reason for it. Like, as you go through the text, just a quick reading, you'll see they're suing each other. Men are sleeping with prostitutes. Women are dressing like prostitutes, and some other women are dressing like men. People are getting drunk at communion. I mean, you know you have a drinking problem when... this church it's a mess. But why? Why is this church a mess? Why is this church a mess unlike any other church in the New Testament era? Why did they have these gross problems of immorality and paganism, things seeping into the church in a way that no other church does? It's a really, really good reason. Because they're reaching people that no other church is reaching. God is doing something in Corinth that we do not see to this degree in any other place in the New Testament. He's reaching people with no moral upbringing. I mean, straight up pagans. People with dark past. People who've never had a parent or a coach or a pastor tell them, maybe you shouldn't invite your pastor out for beer at Hooters. They don't know how to act. It's a beautiful mess. And so over the past few years, this book has been a treasure to me because we've seen a bit of a beautiful mess here. And I love it personally. You know what my favorite feedback from a sermon was? He's not here today, so I can share this. Earlier this summer, I had finished one of my sermons, and I came out to do the benediction, the Lord bless you and keep you. And it literally, as I said, go in peace, someone up towards the front said loud enough for me to hear from the stage, and people all around to hear, that was a great effing sermon. And my heart was warmed. That was the best benediction ever. Now, why is it appropriate to drop the F-bomb in church at the benediction? No. But you know what I loved about that? Because I know that man. And that man does not know how to act. He doesn't. He doesn't know how to behave in church. He doesn't know how to do church. But he knows Jesus. And it's beautiful. And don't you go doing that, though. When I read through the gospel, something about this feels so right. Like you read about the people that Jesus attracted, and what is it? There's a woman, a prostitute. She looks like a prostitute. She dresses like a prostitute. And what is she doing? She's at his feet, weeping, washing his feet with her tears and her hair. And everyone around is like, if you knew what this woman was, don't you see who she is? And Jesus is like, but I see her heart. She knows me. You look at Matthew, the tax collector, and all of his raunchy friends. And what do when they meet Jesus? They don't even know any better. They're like, let's throw the greatest party for Jesus ever. And you just imagine people are getting drunk and stuff because they're so excited. You got to meet Jesus. Like, is it right? No, it's wrong. These people don't even know how to act. But there's something beautiful about it. So today, we're going to start this journey in this really messed up church of Corinth. And we're going to take the time to listen to their story about how they began and how it became this beautiful mess of a church. And we're going to tee up a question that's going to be the question that's going to lead us for the next 9 months, the question that the Apostle Paul seems to be answering as we go through these pages. And it's this. I want you to listen carefully, because I think it's a question that applies to us. How do I grow in godliness when I live in a world that is godless? Like, how do I become more like Jesus when my work, my government, my schools, my entertainment, my friends, everything in my life is drawing me away from him, stands for another set of values, points in another direction? Like, how do I live for Jesus when I'm in a world that does not know him or love him? So the first thing we need to know about 1 Corinthians, but before we even start this, is we need to realize that we're entering into a much broader conversation. So when you very early on, chapter 1, the Apostle Paul says, hey, I got this report from Chloe's house, and I heard about the stuff going on there. And so what we're going to see is right from the very beginning, the Apostle Paul, he is not just writing this like, hey, here's a treaty on how to do church and how to do life. He's responding to reports, to questions they ask. At least half the letter is literally, point by point, him answering questions that they asked. That they sent him a letter and he's responding to it. So it's like have you ever listened to someone when they're on the phone and like you only hear one half of it, so you have to kind of make up in your mind what the other half is happening. That's what we're doing in 1 Corinthians. The other thing that makes this even more complex is that this is not his first letter that he's written to them. If you're reading chapter 5, verse 9, he refers to his previous letter, which would make 1 Corinthians actually 2 Corinthians. Yeah, so like technically it's 2 Corinthians, and then you read 2 Corinthians, and he refers to another letter in between the two letters, and you realize that 2 Corinthians is actually 4 Corinthians. That's right. So there's at least 4 letters that we believe there's at least 4 letters that he wrote to them, and we only have 2 of those. So we only have part of the conversation going on. So very practically, this means that when we interpret this text, we need to listen like we're listening to half of a conversation. We need to be aware of that, which means we need to listen carefully. And so it's going to be really, really, really important that we try and put what he's saying into as broad a possible context as we can, that we put it as much as possible back into the Corinthian situation and ground it in facts and not theories. So like if you think they're asking one question when they're actually asking a different one, and you read his answer, you're going to have a very different interpretation. Context is going to be key when we come to 1 Corinthians. So let me just give you a few fun examples, and we'll dive into these in almost every single chapter as we go. 1 Corinthians chapter 9. Do you not know that in the race all the runners run, but only one gets the prize? So sure, we know that. But when we read this in the context of 1 Corinthians, it's helpful to know that every other year they were the site of the Isthmian Games. Something like the Olympic Games. The world's best athletes descended upon Corinth, and they had this huge games that people from all over the world came to see. Like the size of, like it said, over 50,000 people would show up for any individual series of games. So we read that in this context of, when he's talking about runners, when he's talking about boxing, when he's talking about these athletic analogies, we can now fix it. We have fixed points on it. How about this? Just as a body, the one, has many parts, but all of its many parts form one body, so it is with Christ. So we're like, okay. And then Paul, if you read this in 1 Corinthians chapter 12, you see, then Paul gets all anatomical. He's like, some of you are like an eye, and some are like an ear, and some are like hands, and some are like feet, and all of them have to work together, and some are like unmentionable parts. Right? So he goes through this whole thing. You're like, okay, that's great, but it's helpful to know that in ancient Corinth, it was the site of a major temple to Asclepius, the god of healing. And what do you do when you go to worship Asclepius? You say, I've got this sick part of my body. You make a prayer votive in the shape of that body part, and you bring it to him. If you go to Corinth today, you'll see in their museum all kinds of hands and feet and body parts. There's brains on the side and unmentionable parts. Yikes. Yeah, I'm going to turn that. So when you go there, you realize the Apostle Paul is pulling language right out of their immediate context. They saw people walking to the temple with body parts every day. And he says, you are the temple. You are the parts. Huh? So when we go through almost every single chapter, we're going to want to ground it as much as possible in the original context. Almost every chapter of this letter has some historical, cultural, geographic, or sociological context that gives the text meaning and shape. All right? So today we're not going to start in 1 Corinthians. We're actually going to start in the beginning, which is Acts chapter 18, which is the story of how the Corinthian church started, how the Apostle Paul showed up, preached the gospel, and the church was planted there. Before we dive into that specific text there, you can turn there if you want and hold that place. I'm going to take about 10 minutes, and we're going to nerd out. No cheers? We're going to go into history, geography, and spirituality, and we're going to get deep into some details here. Please be patient with me. If this feels academic and irrelevant, hold on, because this stuff is going to be so important when we get to the juicy details about your sex life and about how you spend your money and about how you do relationships with those outside the church. This is going to be crucial, okay? All right, woo, yeah, okay, so let's start out with that. This is the site of ancient Corinth, and we're going to start by talking about the history of ancient Corinth. Let me give you a thumbnail sketch just in the time period that really relates to us. So you start a few hundred years before the Apostle Paul showed up. You think time of Alexander the Great. In that time period, Corinth was a great Greek city-state, like Athens or Sparta. It's one of those big ones. It was fiercely independent, fiercely Greek. And then, in 146 BC, the Romans show up. What do the Romans say? Hey, would you please consider joining our empire? And what does Corinth say? No, we won't. Whatever. Welcome to Sparta type language there. And Rome does what they do to every other civilization prior to that. They kill every man, and then they take every woman and child, sell them into slavery, and raise the city and set them as an example. This is what happens when you defy Rome. So for 102 years, the city sits destroyed. And then in 44 BC, a guy you've probably heard of, Julius Caesar, he has a problem. And the problem is this: Rome has been too successful. The city itself is becoming too big. Too many Roman citizens, too many freedmen, too many ex-soldiers are moving in, too many wealthy people competing for the same space. It's just too much. And the empire's becoming too big. Like, it's hard to control. How do you control the ideology and values and allegiance of people way over there? So he gets an idea. I'm going to take tens of thousands of Romans and I'm going to transplant them and give them their own city, their own little Rome, here and here and here and here, all over the empire, and these are called the Roman colonies. In particular, he's looking to get rid of ex-soldiers and freedmen, like slaves who purchased their freedom, because they become really restless. In a couple chapters, that's going to be really important, so tuck that away. Now, while this might not mean anything to you right now, this is going to form almost everything we think about in our conversation in Corinth. So when in 44 BC, when Julius Caesar rebirths Corinth, it is no longer a Greek city-state. It is a Roman colony. The purpose of the Roman colony is twofold. One, to solve the space problem of all the people from Rome. But more importantly, for our context, it is designed as a Roman outpost. It is designed to show the people of the world the greatness of Rome. Roman food and Roman language and Roman buildings and Roman architecture and Roman government and Roman values and Roman allegiances. It is intentionally trying to be an outpost assigned to the world. This is the glory of Rome. Don't you want to be part of it? So, Romans in Corinth are going to declare Caesar is Lord. In fact, in the middle of town, there's this giant temple to Caesar himself. It's emperor worship. They didn't actually worship the emperor, but they worship all of his values and the ideology and the allegiance to him. There in the center of town, this town is founded upon that. Now, Christians, what do Christians declare? 1 Corinthians chapter 1, they declare not Caesar is Lord, but who's Lord? Jesus is Lord. That's right. Oh, so we're going to have some problems. How about this? In Roman culture, you never associate with someone in a lower class unless it somehow benefits you. So 1 Corinthians chapter 11, we are not just Romans, so we are Christians. And so when we sit down for a feast as Christians, it is not appropriate for the rich to eat over here and eat first, and the poor to eat over here if there's any food left. That's not appropriate. That's not okay, because we're not just Romans, we are Christians. Roman culture and Christian culture are going to clash. You are not just Romans, you are Christians. You're called to live out a different set of values, to show people a different way of doing life. You're not just to be an outpost of Roman values and ideology. You are to be an outpost for Christ's kingdom. That's number one. Number two, geography. Corinth lies right here, right in the heart of the Mediterranean. There's the boot of Italy over there on the side, and Corinth is going to be in the middle there of the area we call Greece, just north of the large landmass we call the Peloponnese in the south. And then you see all the way over the side, you'll see like on the far right-hand corner of our screen there is ancient Israel. So you see the whole of the Mediterranean. Corinth is a nice middle point there. So here's the deal. In the ancient world, how do you transport goods and services? Well, if you can do some on land, and the great thing about Corinth is it's at this little thing called an isthmus, which is a land bridge connecting the Peloponnese in the south and the mainland. So anyone who travels north-south has to go through Corinth. That already makes it a valuable place. It's like, you're driving on the highway and you need a rest stop, right? You need somewhere. But more importantly, if you zoom in even more, you'll see that Corinth lies right here at this intersection where it's no more than 4 miles across between the two great sections of the Mediterranean. Westward, it's got two seaports and this one city. Westward, it's facing Rome and all the wealth and all the aristocracy and all the things there. And then eastward, it's facing all the stuff, all the wares, all the slaves, all the wine of Asia. So the only thing standing between the seaports here, the only thing standing between people coming from Asia and people coming from Rome is 4 miles controlled by Corinth. So let's unpack this here. If you're an ancient sea captain, you have two choices here. Choice one, I've got a haul load of slaves, or I've got a haul load of olives, or I've got a haul load of something all the way from Asia, all the way around to Rome. How do I do it? Well, option number one is you sail south, all the way around the Peloponnese there, and you had to go past a place at the very foot of that called Cape Meleos. And what is Cape Meleos famous for? It's like the Cape of Death, the Cape of Fear. It's most famous if you've read the Odyssey. Odysseus himself, he goes there and the water's so rough that he gets thrown off course for 10 years of his life. There's famous sayings about this. Strabo, an ancient historian known for being a bit of a drama queen, though, he says, if you round Cape Meleos twice, forget about home. What's the point? If you go once, you're a lucky man. You go twice, you're dead. Like nobody wants to do that. So option one, you risk losing everything by going past Cape Meleos. Or option two, you sail directly for Corinth. You land in Corinth, and then you get off your boat. You hand over the keys to the nice men there, and there's this road that they've constructed where they will literally take everything off your boat, haul it all the way across the isthmus, load it on another boat for you. Or if your boat's small enough, they'll take your entire boat, haul it from one bay to the next. And so you have 3 to 4 days, you and your men. While they're doing that, you go into Corinth, and Corinth is a place where you get world-class entertainment, some of the best restaurants in the world, famous temple prostitutes. Like, you get to live it up. So here's your options. Option one, you sail around the coast and you face near death. Or option two, you go on a vacation in Corinth. Now, tell me, what option do you think the sea captains chose? So, by the time of the New Testament, virtually all east-west traffic and all north-south traffic went through Corinth. And here's the thing. When you have all the wealth and all the wealthy people of the Roman Empire traveling through one little city, what happens? You get wealthy. By the time the Apostle Paul shows up there, Corinth is dripping with wealth. Tolls, services, entertainment, hotels, restaurants, trade negotiations. There was money to be made everywhere. Like stupid money. Like people driving Bentleys and drinking Cristal money. Like this is crazy money here. And unlike other places across the ancient world, though, Corinth had something unique about it. It was a place of opportunity. Like all the wealth was not trapped in like some landed aristocracy in a class system. Here's the thing. An average Joe, like Roman freeman could show up there and be like, hey, I'm hardworking, I'm going to make a way, and could walk out of there in a few years a self-made millionaire. Like, this is insane. Like, things like this don't just happen in the ancient world. So this is the American dream lived large in the ancient world. And just like eras of American history when immigrants all poured in to get a piece of the pie, every ambitious person in the world wanted to go to Corinth. So tell me, what happens when you take tens of thousands of self-absorbed, money-hungry, I'll do anything to get to the top, I just want to make it ahead in life type of people, and you cram them into one small city? What do you get? Manhattan. Or Corinth. Same thing. In fact, one famous New Testament scholar says as much. He says, Gordon Fee, a leading New Testament scholar, says, Paul's Corinth was at once the New York, the Los Angeles, and the Las Vegas of the ancient world. You get that? Yeah. So that you get this influx of businessmen and sailors and people who have time to waste, people who have too much money, more money than they know what to do with, and it creates this massive industry of personal luxuries like restaurants, spas, entertainment, sporting events, and a massive, an absolutely massive adult industry. If you want to be rich and famous, or if you want to see people who are rich and famous, you go to Corinth. If you are young, sexy, greedy, Corinth is your city. So we have history. It's this how it was formed as a Roman colony and how that affects everything. And then we have this geography, how it just creates this great place of wealth and this intersection of the whole world passing through this one little isthmus, this one town, and all of these factors coming together. And then last but not least, we get to spirituality. So Corinth was deeply religious, but I want you to hear this. It was deeply religious in a way that you and I would feel really uncomfortable with. Deeply religious in a way that would feel really irreligious to us. So temples were everywhere. If you go to ancient Corinth, you'll see in the center of town, one of the biggest city center, there's two major temples. This is one of them, the Temple of Apollo, right there in the middle of town. So everything, like you're getting your meat and your whatever, and you're in the shadow of the temple. They're everywhere. In particular, there was a place overlooking the town, this mountain called the Acrocorinth, and it was considered a sacred spot. And so the road going up there had at least, that we know of, 26 sacred sites on it. Not all of them temples, but at least 26 sacred sites. And if you explore this, you're going to find that the Romans, in their thinking, more gods is more. Like, more is always more when it comes to this. So if you want to make sure that your life is blessed and everything's taken care of, you're gonna not just worship Poseidon and Apollo, but you're also going to add, as many gods as you can, Eclipsis and et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. So this bled over into everything too. The important thing to realize is, like, the markets were connected to the temples. So you do your sacrifice at the temple, and then that meat would go over to the market. So your meat is food sacrificed to idols. At any business dinner, you'd start out by having like some priest of some god come in, offer a prayer to that god, pour out a glass of wine in honor of that god. Like, you go through every political event, every holiday, every dinner, everything in their lives was somehow connected to a Roman god. There were no secular spaces. There were no secular spaces. You go to a sporting event, and it's a prayer to a god. It's a secular event in honor of the gods. Education, politics, entertainment, athletics, business transactions, restaurants, holidays, they're all directly connected to some Roman god. Even your sex life. Even your sex life is sacred. So at the very top of the Acrocorinth is this spot right here, which is quite a hike to get to, by the way. You should be impressed with this picture. So after about an hour of hiking, you will find this at the very top, and it is the temple of Aphrodite, the goddess of erotic love. And part of the worship, according to Strabo, again, known for exaggeration, but still, this, even if it's in the ballpark, he says that at one time there were over 1,000 worship leaders there. Do you know what the worship leaders did at the temple of Aphrodite? Yeah, we also call them sacred prostitutes. So this is a place that is just famously perverse. The adult industry in Corinth is massive and pervasive, but get this, it's not just massive and pervasive like it is today in America. It's massively pervasive, and it's socially acceptable. It's everywhere and religiously approved. So Corinth, one last little fact, and then we'll get to the text. Corinth was so raunchy. It was so Las Vegas. It was so Amsterdam. That some of the people one poet, and then it got used more broadly, actually took the word Corinth and turned it into a verb. So to Corinthianize. It literally means, according to the scholar Gordon Fee, to engage in indiscriminate sexual activity. So, like, can you imagine? Like, your town gets such a reputation, they'd be like, oh my goodness, he just went Phoenixville. Yeah. And she shows up, and you're like, wow, she's so paly right now. Oh, did I just King of Prussia? So you get the point. Like, this place became a reputation across the ancient world for being that place. So if you're the Apostle Paul, put on your Apostle Paul hat for a minute, and God has called you to reach the Gentiles, to reach the unreached world, to go preach the gospel where it's never been preached, to start churches, little groups of Jesus followers all over the world in the parts where it's never yet gone. So you come to Corinth, and God says, I'm sending you there. What do you do when you come to Corinth? How do you possibly start a group of Jesus followers when you're starting with this? And the answer we're going to find in Acts chapter 18 is that you do everything you can to avoid Corinthians. If you want to start a good church in Corinth, you don't start with Corinthians. And this is what we see in Acts chapter 18, starting in verse 1. After this, Paul left Athens and went to Corinth. There, he met a Jew. Woohoo! This is a Jew. This is a guy who loves God, who doesn't do all that Corinthian stuff, named Aquila, a native of Pontus, who had recently come from Italy with his wife Priscilla because Claudius had ordered all the Jews to leave Rome. So this is Aquila and Priscilla. You may have heard of them. They're kind of a big deal. This is going to become a New Testament power couple here. It's Paul's version of Bob and Wendy Dorico, if you've been around GVF for any time. Yeah, so Paul's super excited. Everything's in common with them. That you're Jews, I'm a Jew. You're a Christian already, I'm a Christian. You're tent makers? No way, I'm a tent maker. Seriously. We can see that they're tent makers. In fact, the next verse says, Paul went to see them, and because he was a tent maker, as they were, he stayed and worked with them. Like if you go into Corinth today, you walk down the streets, you can see the ancient little market that was there. And this is an example of one of the still standing market stalls. They think it was a stall just like this that Paul, Aquila, and Priscilla worked and lived in there in Corinth. So this just gives you the scene. So Paul's like, oh, this is so great. This is gonna be great. But here's the thing. God did not send Paul into Corinth to have best friends forever, right, with some Christians. He didn't. He didn't send Paul into Corinth to make tents, although it was probably big money in that in Corinth, because it was the year of the Isthmian Games, and everyone needed a tent. Paul was sent to Corinth to reach the city. So what's his next move? Watch this. Verse 4. Every Sabbath he reasoned in the synagogue, trying to persuade Jews and Greeks. When Silas and Timothy came from Macedonia, Paul devoted himself exclusively to preaching and testifying to the Jews that Jesus was the Messiah. Now, quick question. Who's in a synagogue? Jews are in a synagogue. That's right. So who's Paul trying to reach? Jews. So he's like, I would love to reach Corinth, but wouldn't it be great if we could just start something right here? All of you people look like church people. This is great. Okay, so you don't know Jesus yet, but we agree on the Ten Commandments, right? Can we start there? We agree that there is one God, right? We have the same morality. None of you are going to visit the temple prostitutes. We speak the same language. So he goes in there and he devotes himself exclusively to preaching to the Jews about Jesus. And unfortunately, though, that does not go so well. Verse 6. But when they opposed Paul and became abusive, now we're not quite sure what this means. Usually involves beating him with sticks or punching him in the face. When they did that, he shook out his clothes, which is, I think we should do something like that. If you're offended, that's how you write someone off in that culture. He shook out his clothes in protest and said to them, "Your blood be on your heads. I am innocent of it. From now on, I am going to the Gentiles. I am offering you the greatest news in the world. I just told you about Jesus, and you've completely rejected it. So here's what I'm going to do. I'm going to tell the Corinthians. I'm going to go out there to those people who worship pagan idols, who sleep with temple prostitutes, who don't know the difference between right and wrong, who have horrific ways of living. I'm going to go to them, and I'm going to talk to them about Jesus." And so where do you begin when you do that? This is funny. Paul left the synagogue and went next door. It's like, hey, here's a house. Let's try this one. So he goes in and he talks to the house of Titius Justus, a worshiper of God. He's like, hey, he's a Roman, but he still worships God. Like, he knows who God is. So maybe, can I start a church in your house? And somehow that works out. And we find that in the next few pages, like this moment is a moment that we don't want to speed past, because this is the moment right here when the Corinthian church will become the first primarily Gentile, that means non-Jewish, non-church people, congregation in the world. It's going to be filled with sketchy people. We're talking like ex-prostitutes, people from the slave trade, people with a dark, dark past, people who don't know how to act, don't know how to look like church people. But here's the funny thing. Once Paul actually steps out and does that, he actually attracts some of the church people. Look at verse 8. It says this: Crispus, the synagogue leader, big guy in the Jewish world there, and his entire household believed in the Lord, and many of the Corinthians who heard Paul believed and were baptized. Like, I want you to imagine this. Imagine what church would be like in those first few days. So you're like, here's Crispus and his family. They're all like wearing their staunch clothes, and like all the women have denim skirts on, and like, and then you have over here like sitting right next to like an ex-prostitute, sitting right next to people who are still sleeping with prostitutes, sitting right next to people who don't know the difference between right and wrong. Can you imagine how messed up that? Can you imagine what their benedictions must have been like? Can you imagine how hard it must have been to start a children's ministry there? The vetting process must have been ugly. But anyways, all kidding aside, like when you think about this, this is a dark, dark world. And the Apostle Paul has this crazy mixture of people coming in. And we know that he must have been pretty terrified about this, because in the very next verse we see that Jesus actually has to show up to talk him out of running away. One night the Lord, Jesus, spoke to Paul in a vision. Do not be afraid. Keep on speaking. Do not be silent. For I'm with you. No one's going to attack and harm you, because I have many people in this city. Like, Paul, I know you look out and all you see are Corinthians. Like, all you see are self-absorbed, sexed up, filthy, nasty pagans. But I see my people. I see people that I died for. There's no one too messed up. There's no one too sinful. There's no one too lost for me. I have people in this city. Which asks the question, how do you view your neighbors? I want you to see too, the only instruction that Jesus is going to give him, like, he's not going to be like, here's what you do, or here's some money to start a fund, or here's the program you need to launch. All he says is, the way that you're going to reach these people is keep on speaking, do not be silent. So what's your plan? What's your big plan for reaching this lost people, these people who've never even heard of Jesus, who don't know right from wrong? What are you going to do it? And he's just like, just keep talking about Jesus. Like, just keep talking about Jesus. Like, just keep talking about Jesus. So Paul stayed in Corinth for 1.5 years, teaching them the word of God, and that's it. No miracles, no great sermons, no riots in the street, no bonfire of the vanities like you have in Ephesus, none of that. No major healings, no lightning from heaven, no riots. How did so many Corinthians become followers of Jesus? I just didn't stop talking about Jesus. And we're like, and that's it. I just kept talking about Jesus. Could it be that sometimes we make this way, way harder than it needs to be? Could it be that maybe some of those people who seem so far from God, who seem pagan, who seem evil, who seem filthy and nasty and intimidating and completely unlike us, could it be that maybe just no one's ever talked to them about Jesus before? So that's the story of the Corinthian church, and we could stop there, but Luke, the author of Acts, is actually going to give us one more brief story, and I just want to camp out here, finish on this, because I think this is going to give us one more clue. So what made the Corinthian church this beautiful mess? What made it what it was is because it was reaching people that no other church was reaching. And can I just say, church, I pray for the problems they have. That is a great reason to have problems. I wish we reached too many pagans. I wish every benediction we had someone cussing out loud. But there's another problem that exacerbates all of this, and that's what we see starts in verse 12. While Gallio was proconsul of Achaia, the Jews of Corinth made a united attack on Paul and brought him to the place of judgment. This man, they charged, is persuading people to worship God's law in ways contrary to the law. So just nerd out for 1 second here. This is an important historical moment where you see the cross-section of ancient history and the Bible in a way that you can put it back together in a way that almost no other passage can. We have this inscription. It was discovered at Delphi among about 9 other inscriptions, and in it, it says, Gallio was proconsul of Achaia from 51 to 52 AD. Now, it doesn't say that exactly, but it says the date of when he was proconsul so that we can confirm the exact time in which this happened. So the Apostle Paul is in Corinth, and Gallio was proconsul, and they called him to the judgment place. Literally, it says in the text, the Bema, and you can go there today and you stand right there. Like, we can recreate this. Right there, the Apostle Paul is standing before this platform called the Bema, and there up top is the proconsul, the guy who's in charge of the entire region, sitting there, called to make judgment on the Apostle Paul. Cool. Verse 14, just as Paul was about to speak to defend himself, Gallio said to them, if you Jews were making a complaint about some misdemeanor or serious crime, it would be reasonable for me to listen to you. But since it involves questions about words and names of your own law, settle the matter yourselves. I will not judge of such things. So he drove them off. Gallio says, I don't care. So the crowd then turned on Sosthenes, the synagogue leader, and beat him in front of the proconsul, and Gallio showed no concern whatever. So what's the point here? What just happened? What did we just see? Why does Luke want us to say, hey, wait, there's one thing you need to know about Corinth. So Paul stayed there for 18 months. He reached all these types of non-Christian pagan people. And then this one scene, though, you need to know. Why do you need to know that? Because this is the moment in which persecution of the church in Corinth failed. So let's put this in a bit broader context. If you compare Corinth to Ephesus and Rome and Philippi and Thessalonica, like Corinth is deeply pagan, worldly, antithetical to Christianity in almost every imaginable way, and it probably is worse than some of the others. But the fact of the matter is Ephesus was really, really bad. And so is Thessalonica, and so is Philippi, and so is Rome. Like, Ephesus was full of, I don't know if you remember this, sorcerers and witches and pagan temples and prostitutes, the same type of stuff. And Rome and Thessalonica and Philippi, they had the exact same cultural allegiances to Caesar, like, had all these problems. So why is it, if you have all the same types of problems in Corinth that you'd have in these other towns, why is it that Corinth is so much worse? Like, why doesn't Ephesus and Thessalonica and the Christians in Rome, why don't those churches struggle with paganism, prostitution, and gross immorality? So what makes it so difficult to be a Christian in Corinth? And one of the leading scholars, New Testament scholars of our day, a guy named William Barclay, suggests, and I think he's on something here, he says the only substantive difference between the church at Corinth and these other churches is that it didn't experience what he calls social alienation. The only difference between Corinth and Ephesus, the major difference, was they weren't persecuted. So in Ephesus, they might beat you or destroy your career or take all your possessions for talking about Jesus. In Philippi, they might imprison you, beat you. Thessalonica, they could burn down your house, kick you out of town. Just a few years after this in Rome, they will literally slaughter Christians en masse. But in Corinth, you say, I'm a Christian, and they say, so? Great, my name's Paul. So you worship Jesus, that's great, but you're still coming along to Aphrodite's temple with us later, right? Right. So you're a Christian. Okay, you're a Christian now. Great, great, great. You go do that thing, but at the business dinner tonight when we have to offer the sacrifice, you're still going to be part of that, right? Like you're a Christian, but you're still a Corinthian, right? You're still going to participate in our naked athletic games, and our pagan holidays, and our raunchy entertainment, and our guys' night out, right? So I want you to get this. The great struggle for the Corinthian Christians was that there was no persecution. They were fully accepted into their society. Their lives were still fully integrated with the world around them. That being a Christian changed almost nothing in how they lived, how they ate, how they celebrated, how they worked, how they relaxed, how they had sex. So sure, I'm a Christian. Of course I love Jesus, but that doesn't have anything to do with what I do at work, what I do on Friday night, or what I do on vacation. Sure, I'm a Christian, but that doesn't change what I watch on TV or what I buy. So my favorite illustration of this is if you go to Corinth today, you go out of the center city, you cross over the main road, and then you go into what would be the ancient arts and restaurant district, right? So there's these two big theaters, some big restaurants that were connected to them. You walk down to that, and there's this road, and in the pavement, right there, that little fenced-off area, you find this. It's this stone in the pavement, and it says on that stone, in that pavement, at that spot, it says, Erastus, in return for his aedileship, laid this pavement at his own expense. So when the Apostle Paul was in Corinth, at that time, one of the most prominent men in Corinth was a guy named Erastus. All right? He was a government official in charge of overseeing the treasury, the slave trade, the multitude of pagan temples. He was in charge of all of that. And here's where it gets interesting. The Apostle Paul mentions Erastus. So while Paul was there in Corinth, he wrote a letter to the church in Rome. You may have heard of it. It's called Romans. Yeah, so he wrote that there, and at the end of his letter, he sends all of his greetings like, hey, tell so-and-so, I'll check you later, and he says stuff about Priscilla and Aquila, hey, they say hi, and then he says, in chapter 16, verse 23, Erastus, who is the city's director of works, and our brother Quartus send you their greetings. So here's what we take in from that. Erastus oversaw the slave trade. He cared for the pagan temples of the entire city, and he followed Jesus. So how does that work? How do you remain faithful to Jesus and faithfully serve a government that runs a slave trade and temple prostitution? How do you publicly oversee all the temples and all that takes place in them and believe that there's only one God named Jesus who should be worshipped? How do you follow Jesus when everything in your work and everything in the movies and everything in the news and everything in our schools and everything in our neighborhoods is pulling you in a different direction? How do you do it? How do you remain faithful to Jesus when all your non-Christian friends invite you to just be part, I know you're a Christian, but just be part of what we're doing? So that, my friends, is what leads Paul 3 years later to write the book of 1 Corinthians. They're a mess, but they're a beautiful mess. And we're going to take the next 9 months to talk about how do we live as Christians in a world where we're not persecuted, where we're invited in at every level to participate, where there's no social alienation for us, and we're invited into all of these things. How do we follow Christ? I just want to close with the opening words of 1 Corinthians. It goes like this. Paul, called to be an apostle of Jesus Christ by the will of God, and our brother Sosthenes. Is that the same Sosthenes that was beat in front of the Bema? Maybe. To the church of God in Corinth, to those sanctified in Christ Jesus and called to be his holy people, together with all those everywhere who call on the name of the Lord Jesus Christ, grace and peace be to you. To you, church in Phoenixville. I've heard about your mess. I got the reports. I know you're a mess. I know your lives are so integrated with this world, with this government system, with this entertainment, with everything that is pulling you in other directions. And I'm not calling you out of the city, but I'm calling you to the city. You have been made holy. You're sanctified by Jesus Christ. And for the next 9 months, we're going to talk about what does it mean to be called to be holy. Let's pray. Father, I thank you, Lord, for this story of Corinth. I pray, God, that we would not just learn from them, but I pray, God, that we would become like Corinth in the best sense. That we would have the same problems they have, not because we refuse to follow you, Lord, but because we're attracting those and reaching those who are so desperately lost. God, I pray in the weeks to come as we dive into these heavy issues of what does it mean to follow Jesus at work, follow Jesus in our home life and our sex life, follow Jesus in how we watch TV and how we shop and how we live. God, I pray that you give us courage. I pray that you would come to us and speak to us and say, don't be afraid. God, I pray for those here who've got friends who are deeply pagan, totally lost, Lord, that even this week you give them courage to speak out to them. Pray this in Jesus' name. Amen.